The most dangerous messages are never the ones that arrive with anger. They are the ones that arrive with a smile. It was 11:53 on a Thursday night when my phone lit up on the kitchen counter. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a late-night weather report playing somewhere in the living room. I had just finished rinsing a coffee mug and loading the last plate into the dishwasher. It had been an ordinary day, the kind of day that disappears from memory almost as soon as it ends. At least that was what I thought before I looked down at my screen. Rebecca's name appeared in the notification. I remember smiling slightly. We had spent most of the evening in separate parts of the house. She was upstairs scrolling through her phone while I finished some work emails in the home office. That had become normal for us lately. Not bad, not hostile, just normal. Married people settle into routines. At least that is what I always believed. I picked up the phone and opened the message. Then I read it again. And then a third time. Jason and I are taking a trip together next month. Do not be jealous. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. Outside the kitchen window, the neighborhood remained completely still. Streetlights reflected off parked cars. A sprinkler system clicked somewhere down the block. Everything looked exactly the same. Yet something inside me shifted. Jason Mitchell, Rebecca's first love. The man she occasionally mentioned over the years whenever old memories came up. The man who had somehow found his way back into her life 6 months earlier through social media. At first, I had not thought much about it. People reconnect with old friends all the time. They exchange messages. They remember shared experiences. Life moves on. That was what I told myself anyway. I set the phone down and poured myself a glass of water. The kitchen clock moved quietly toward midnight. Looking back, I think part of me already knew this message was about more than a trip. Not because of Jason. Not because of jealousy. Because of how casually the decision had been presented. There was no discussion. No conversation. No question. Just information. A decision had been made, and I was being informed after the fact. A minute later, I heard footsteps coming down the stairs. Rebecca entered the kitchen wearing gray sweatpants and an oversized sweatshirt. She looked comfortable, relaxed, completely unaware that I had just spent the last 60 seconds questioning everything I thought I understood about our marriage. She opened the refrigerator and grabbed a bottle of water. Then she looked at me. "Did you see my text?" she asked. Her voice sounded cheerful, casual, like someone asking whether I had remembered to take out the trash. "I did," I said. She nodded. "Good. I wanted to tell you before I booked everything." I studied her expression carefully. There was no nervousness, no hesitation, just confidence. The confidence of someone who already knew what the outcome would be. "You and Jason?" I asked. "Yes." She twisted the cap off the bottle and took a sip. "It is not a big deal." I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, because of how certain she sounded. The decision had already been categorized, labeled, and filed away in her mind. Not a big deal. Discussion complete. "Interesting," I said. She narrowed her eyes slightly. "What does that mean?" I glanced down at my phone again. At the message. At the words that suddenly felt much heavier than they looked. "Nothing," I replied. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then she shrugged. "I knew you would understand." That sentence stayed with me long after she returned upstairs. I knew you would understand. Not I hoped you would understand. Not can we talk about it. I knew you would understand. There is a difference. A very important difference. Around 1 in the morning, I was still sitting at the kitchen table. The coffee I had poured hours earlier had gone cold. The neighborhood was completely silent now. I unlocked my phone and reread the message one more time. That was when I realized the word that would keep me awake all night was not Jason. It was not jealous. It was together. Because for the first time in a very long time, I found myself wondering whether Rebecca still viewed our marriage the same way I did. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the message seemed to reappear against the darkness. By 6 o'clock the next morning, I was already sitting at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee. Pale sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating the quiet neighborhood outside. A man across the street walked his dog. A delivery truck rolled slowly down the block. Everything looked exactly the same as it had the day before. That was the strange thing about life. The biggest changes often happen when the world appears completely normal. Rebecca came downstairs around 7. She wore a navy workout jacket and white sneakers, her phone already in her hand. She smiled when she saw me. "You are up early." "Could not sleep," I said. She poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter. For a few moments, neither of us mentioned the trip. Then she glanced at her phone and smiled at something on the screen. It was a small smile. Brief. Almost invisible. But I noticed it. Looking back, I had started noticing those smiles months earlier. At the time, they seemed harmless. Now they felt different. Jason texted? I asked casually. She looked up, surprised for a moment. Yeah, we are figuring out a few details. Then she took another sip of coffee and changed the subject. The ease with which his name entered our morning conversation stayed with me long after she left for the gym. Jason Mitchell had not always been part of our lives. In fact, for most of our marriage, I never heard his name at all. Rebecca and I had been married for 12 years. During those 12 years, Jason existed only as an occasional story from her past. A funny memory from high school. A name attached to old photographs. Nothing more. Then 6 months earlier, everything changed. It started with a social media message. Rebecca mentioned it during dinner one evening. Guess who contacted me today? She had said. I remember looking up from my plate. Who? Jason Mitchell. Then she laughed. I have not talked to him in forever. At the time, I smiled and continued eating. Why would I have reacted differently? Former classmates reconnect all the time. It seemed completely normal. The messages continued. Then the phone call started. At first they happened once every few weeks. Then once every few days. Eventually, it became common to hear Rebecca laughing quietly while talking to him from the back patio or the guest room. Whenever I asked about it, she always had the same answer. We are just catching up. Maybe she believed that. Maybe she needed to believe it. The following week, I started paying closer attention. Not because I was suspicious, because I was curious. I wanted to understand how a person from the distant past had suddenly become such a regular part of the present. One evening, we sat together in the living room watching television. Rebecca's phone lit up 3 times within 10 minutes. Each time, her eyes moved instantly toward the screen. Each time, the same smile appeared. By itself, it meant nothing. But patterns matter. Patterns tell stories that individual moments cannot. A few days later, we attended a neighborhood barbecue. Families gathered beneath shade trees while children played games in the grass. At one point, someone asked Rebecca what she had been up to lately. Her answer surprised me. I have been reconnecting with old friends. Then she immediately started talking about Jason. Not work. Not family. Not our plans. Jason. I remember standing there holding a paper plate, listening as she described conversations, memories, and inside jokes that had survived 2 decades. Everyone around us seemed perfectly comfortable. Why would they not be? Nothing inappropriate had happened. Nothing obvious anyway. Yet something inside me felt unsettled. That feeling grew stronger with every passing week. And now, sitting alone at the kitchen table days after receiving that message, I finally understood why. The problem was never that Jason returned. The problem was how much space he had been allowed to occupy once he did. Once I started paying attention, I realized the changes had not happened overnight. They had arrived slowly, disguised as ordinary moments. A text message here. A phone call there. A smile that lingered a little longer than usual. The problem with gradual change is that you rarely notice it while it is happening. You only see it clearly when you look back. The following Saturday morning, Rebecca and I sat across from each other at the kitchen table. Sunlight spilled through the windows while the coffee maker hummed quietly beside the counter. The neighborhood outside looked peaceful. A man jogged past the house. Children rode bicycles down the street. Everything felt normal. Yet Rebecca barely looked up from her phone during breakfast. Every few minutes, the screen lit up. Every few minutes, her attention drifted somewhere else. I found myself wondering how many conversations a person could have before those conversations became part of their daily life. Later that afternoon, we went grocery shopping. It was one of those routine weekend errands married couples do without thinking. We walked through familiar aisles. He just sent me a picture from a restaurant he thinks I would like. The answer was innocent enough. But what caught my attention was how naturally it came. There was no hesitation. No awareness that mentioning him had become a regular part of our conversations. That evening, we sat in the living room watching a movie. At least, I was watching the movie. Rebecca spent most of the time texting. Occasionally, she would laugh quietly. Looking back, I do not think she was hiding anything. In some ways, that made it more revealing. People are careful about things they know are wrong. Rebecca acted as though everything was perfectly normal. A few days later, we met friends for dinner at a local restaurant. The atmosphere was relaxed. Warm lighting, familiar faces, easy conversation. At one point, someone asked Rebecca if she had any travel plans coming up. Her entire face brightened. She immediately started talking about the upcoming trip, destinations, restaurants, sightseeing plans. Then Jason's name entered the conversation again. Naturally, effortlessly, as though he had always been there. I watched the reactions around the table. Nobody seemed concerned. Why would they be? Rebecca presented everything as completely harmless. Most people accepted the situation exactly as she described it. But I noticed something else. She spoke about the trip with excitement. She spoke about Jason with enthusiasm. Yet she never once asked what I thought about any of it. On the drive home, streetlights reflected across the windshield while traffic moved steadily through the evening darkness. Rebecca stared out the passenger window. "I think this trip is exactly what I need," she said suddenly. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "What do you mean?" She shrugged. "Just some time away. Something different." I nodded slowly. Then neither of us spoke for several minutes. The silence felt heavier than usual. When we finally pulled into the driveway, I remained seated in the car for a moment after the engine stopped. Rebecca had already gone inside. The porch light cast a warm glow across the front yard. Everything looked peaceful. Yet as I sat there alone, a realization settled quietly into my mind. The trip itself was not the biggest problem. The real problem was that Rebecca had slowly built an entirely separate emotional world, and she seemed genuinely surprised that I could see it. What she did not understand was that every smile, every message, every casual mention of Jason had already told me more than she realized. And the closer the trip became, the harder it was to ignore what those details were beginning to say. The closer the trip became, the more confident Rebecca seemed. That was the part one found most interesting. Most people become cautious when they sense tension. Rebecca became more relaxed, more certain, more convinced that everything was exactly the way she believed it to be. A week after our conversation in the driveway, I came home from work and found travel brochures spread across the dining room table. Airline confirmations sat beside a notebook filled with handwritten plans. Rebecca was sitting in the middle of it all, smiling as she compared hotel options on her laptop. Late afternoon sunlight poured through the windows, turning the entire room golden. She looked genuinely happy. For a moment, I simply stood there watching her. "You seem excited," I said. She looked up immediately. "I am." Then she laughed. "I have not taken a trip like this in years." The wording caught my attention. A trip like this. Not a vacation. Not a getaway. A trip like this. As though it occupied a category all its own. I pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Everything booked?" "Almost." She turned the laptop toward me. "Look at this place." A beautiful waterfront hotel filled the screen. Ocean views. Outdoor dining. Walking distance from local attractions. I nodded politely. "Looks nice." Jason found it. There was his name again. Casual. Automatic. Effortless. Rebecca did not even seem to notice how often she mentioned him anymore. Looking back, I think that was part of the problem. Once something becomes normal in your mind, you stop seeing it clearly. A few days later, we attended a birthday dinner for one of her friends. About a dozen people gathered around a long table inside a busy restaurant. Conversation moved easily from one topic to another. Work, family, travel, sports, the usual subjects. Eventually, someone asked Rebecca about her upcoming plans. Her face lit up immediately. She described destinations, restaurants, and sightseeing opportunities with the enthusiasm of someone counting down the days until a major event. Then one of her friends asked a simple question. "So what does Logan think about all of this?" Rebecca smiled before I could answer. "He is fine with it." The words were delivered with complete confidence. Several people nodded and moved on to another subject. The conversation continued. Nobody seemed surprised. Nobody seemed concerned. Yet I sat there thinking about how quickly she had answered for me. Not asked me. Not looked at me. Answered for me. On the drive home, traffic moved steadily beneath rows of streetlights. Rebecca scrolled through her phone while music played quietly through the speakers. After several minutes, she glanced over. "You were quiet tonight." I kept my eyes on the road. "Was I?" "A little." She smiled. "I think everyone expected you to make a joke about the trip." I laughed softly. Maybe I was not in a joking mood. She looked at me for a moment before returning her attention to the window. The conversation ended there, but the silence that followed felt different. Not uncomfortable, just revealing. By the following weekend, suitcases had started appearing in the guest room. New clothes hung neatly in garment bags. Travel accessories arrived in delivery boxes almost daily. The entire house seemed to be preparing for an event. Rebecca moved through each day with growing excitement. Meanwhile, I found myself becoming calmer. Not because I was accepting the situation, because I was beginning to understand it. One evening, while organizing travel documents, Rebecca looked up and smiled. "I am glad you are not making this difficult." The statement lingered in the room. I set down the book I had been reading and looked at her. What would difficult look like? She laughed. "Arguments. Jealousy. Drama. You know." I nodded slowly. "That sounds exhausting." "Exactly." Then she returned to her paperwork, completely unaware that she had just revealed something important. Rebecca believed the challenge had already passed. She thought the conversation was over. She thought certainty was the same thing as security. What she did not realize was that the most important decisions are often made quietly. And while she was busy preparing for the journey she could see, I had started thinking about one she never imagined. The departure date was less than a week away when something inside me finally became clear. For weeks, I had been trying to decide how I felt about everything. The messages, the phone calls, the trip, the assumptions. But one quiet Tuesday evening, while sitting alone on the back patio watching the sun disappear behind the neighboring houses, I realized I was asking the wrong question. The question was never whether Rebecca should take the trip. The real question was why she felt so comfortable making that decision without truly considering what it meant for us. The neighborhood settled into its usual evening rhythm. Porch lights flickered on. Sprinkler systems activated across freshly cut lawns. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked before falling silent again. Everything looked normal. Yet for the first time in months, my thoughts felt unusually focused. Later that night, Rebecca sat at the kitchen counter reviewing travel confirmations. Her laptop was open. Several reservation emails filled the screen. Every few minutes, she smiled to herself. The excitement seemed genuine, unfiltered. She was already mentally on the trip. Physically, she was still sitting in our kitchen, but emotionally, she had left weeks earlier. "Everything's set?" I asked. She looked up. "Almost." Then she smiled. "I cannot believe it is finally happening." I nodded. "You have been looking forward to it." "Of course." She laughed softly. "Who would not be?" The answer came quickly, automatically, as if there was only one reasonable perspective. I watched her for a moment. Then I returned my attention to the newspaper on the table. The conversation ended there. Looking back, that exchange told me more than she probably intended. Rebecca no longer viewed the situation as something that involved both of us. In her mind, it belonged entirely to her. The following morning, I left for work earlier than usual. Traffic moved steadily through downtown while the local radio station discussed weather forecasts and sports scores. Everything felt routine, predictable, comfortable. Yet somewhere between a stoplight and a coffee shop, I made a decision. It was not dramatic. It was not emotional. It simply felt necessary. During my lunch break, I opened my calendar and scheduled an appointment for the following week. The confirmation email arrived less than 2 minutes later. I stared at the screen for several seconds before closing it. Then I returned to work. No one around me had any idea that something important had just happened. The strange thing about major life decisions is how ordinary they often look from the outside. Over the next several days, Rebecca became increasingly focused on her departure. New clothes arrived in shipping boxes. Travel accessories appeared on countertops. Suitcases stood open in the guest room, waiting to be filled. Every room in the house seemed touched by the upcoming trip. Meanwhile, I found myself becoming quieter. Not withdrawn, not angry, just thoughtful. One evening, I walked past the guest room and noticed Rebecca carefully folding clothes into a suitcase. She looked up and smiled. "I think I finally have everything." I glanced at the packed luggage. "Looks like it." She laughed. "You know, most husbands would probably be asking a million questions by now." I leaned against the doorway. Would that change anything? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She paused for a second before shaking her head. "Probably not." Then she returned to packing. That answer stayed with me long after I walked away. Probably not. There it was again. The certainty. The assumption that everything had already been decided. The belief that discussion no longer mattered. Later that night, after Rebecca went upstairs, I sat alone in the living room. The television remained off. The house was quiet except for the occasional sound of passing cars outside. I opened my phone and looked at the appointment confirmation one more time. Then I locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the coffee table. For weeks, Rebecca had been preparing for the journey she wanted to take. What she did not know was that I had finally started preparing for one of my own. And unlike hers, mine would begin the moment her plane left the ground. The morning Rebecca left felt strangely ordinary. Sunlight poured through the kitchen windows. The coffee maker hummed softly on the counter. A weather forecast played quietly from the television in the living room. If someone had walked through the house that morning, they would have seen nothing unusual. A husband drinking coffee. A wife preparing for a trip. Two people moving through a familiar routine. Yet beneath the surface, everything was changing. Rebecca came downstairs carrying her suitcase shortly after 7. She looked energized, excited, ready. The same expression I had seen growing stronger with each passing day. "Can you believe it is finally here?" she asked. I looked up from my coffee. "You have certainly been counting down the days." She laughed and adjusted the strap on her travel bag. "That obvious?" "A little." The answer made her smile. For a few moments we stood together in the kitchen while morning sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor. Looking back, I remember how normal the scene felt. There was no argument, no confrontation, no emotional goodbye. Just two people standing in a kitchen they had shared for years. Rebecca checked her phone. A familiar smile appeared, then disappeared. I did not need to ask who the message was from. "I should get going," she said. "Traffic to the airport can be terrible." I nodded. "Drive safely." She stepped closer and kissed my cheek. "Do not work too hard while I am gone." Then she picked up her suitcase and headed toward the front door. A few seconds later, I heard the garage door open, then the sound of a car engine starting, then silence. I walked to the front window and watched her back out of the driveway. The vehicle disappeared around the corner. Just like that, she was gone. The house immediately felt different. Not empty, just quiet, as though something had finally settled after weeks of anticipation. I stood there for another minute before returning to the kitchen. My coffee had gone cold. Outside, the neighborhood continued exactly as before. Lawn crews worked on nearby properties. Delivery trucks moved along the street. People walked dogs beneath clear blue skies. Life moved forward without hesitation. Around 9:30, I left the house. The drive took me across town into a business district filled with glass office buildings and busy intersections. Traffic flowed steadily beneath a bright summer sky. I arrived 10 minutes early. The building itself looked ordinary from the outside. Modern, professional, nothing dramatic. I parked, straightened my shirt, and walked inside. The receptionist greeted me politely and directed me toward a conference room overlooking downtown. Floor-to-ceiling windows filled the space with natural light. Several folders rested neatly on a polished table. Everything felt calm, organized, predictable. I remember noticing how steady my hands were. For weeks I had expected this moment to feel emotional. Instead, it felt clear, like finally reaching a destination after driving through fog. The meeting lasted less than an hour. We discussed options, timelines, practical realities. No raised voices, no dramatic revelations, just facts. Sometimes the most important decisions happen in rooms so quiet that nobody outside ever realizes history is being made. When the meeting ended, I shook hands, collected several documents, and walked back to my car. The city looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. People hurried across sidewalks. Traffic lights changed from red to green. Construction crews worked behind orange barriers. Yet something inside me felt lighter. For the first time in a very long time, I was no longer waiting for someone else to decide the direction of my future. Around noon, my phone vibrated. A message from Rebecca appeared on the screen. "Landed. Beautiful weather. Talk later." I read it once, then locked the phone and placed it back in my pocket. Looking back, that message marked the beginning of two completely different journeys. Rebecca believed she was starting a week of adventure. What she did not know was that mine had already begun. And unlike hers, there would be no return ticket waiting at the end. The first few days passed more quietly than I expected. Every morning began the same way. Coffee in the kitchen, sunlight through the windows, the familiar sounds of the neighborhood waking up. Yet something felt different now. Not because Rebecca was gone, because for the first time in a long while, I felt completely present in my own life. There was no uncertainty left to analyze, no decision left to make. The path ahead was becoming clearer with each passing day. Rebecca sent messages regularly. Photographs of restaurants, pictures of scenic views, short updates about places she visited. Everything looked carefully selected. Happy moments, beautiful weather, smiling faces. Looking at them felt strangely similar to watching a travel advertisement. Pleasant, polished, surface level. I responded politely whenever necessary. Hope you are having a good time. Enjoy the day. Safe travels. Nothing more. One afternoon, while working from my home office, my phone buzzed with another message. This one included a photograph of a waterfront cafe. The caption read, "You would love this place." I stared at the screen for a moment before setting the phone down. The message was probably intended as something thoughtful, yet it carried an irony Rebecca could not see. During the previous several months, she had spent so much time reconnecting with her past that she stopped paying attention to the present. Around midweek, I met an old friend for lunch. We had not seen each other in nearly a year. We talked about work, family, aging parents, and future plans. Normal conversations. Real conversations. At one point, he asked how things were going at home. I thought carefully before answering. Complicated, I said. He nodded as though he understood immediately. Maybe he did. Life has a way of teaching similar lessons to different people. When lunch ended, I drove home feeling unexpectedly calm. The future no longer felt frightening. It felt manageable. That realization alone was worth more than I could explain. Thursday morning brought another message from Rebecca. This time she wanted to talk. We spoke briefly on the phone. Her voice sounded cheerful, relaxed. She described a sightseeing tour and a restaurant she particularly enjoyed. Then she laughed. "You sound different." I looked out the kitchen window toward the quiet street beyond. "Different how?" "I do not know," she said. "More distant, maybe." The observation almost made me smile. Distance had become easy to notice once it affected her. "I have just been busy," I replied. A short silence followed. Then she changed the subject. Looking back, I think that was the first moment she sensed something had shifted. Not enough to understand it, just enough to feel it. Later that evening, I reviewed several documents spread across my dining room table. Outside, porch lights glowed beneath a darkening sky. Cars moved through the neighborhood. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across nearby lawns. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had. Yet every signature, every completed form, every step forward carried me closer to a future Rebecca had never considered possible. By Friday, her trip was nearing its end. Another message arrived shortly before noon. "Flying home on Sunday. Cannot wait to see you." I read the words twice. Then I placed the phone face down and returned to work. The strange thing was that I believed her. I believed she genuinely looked forward to coming home. The problem was that she still imagined home as a place frozen in time. A place waiting exactly as she had left it. She did not realize that every day she spent away had quietly transformed something fundamental. That evening I sat alone on the back patio watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. The air felt warm, peaceful. Somewhere in the distance, children laughed while riding bicycles through the neighborhood. It looked like the perfect ending to an ordinary week. Yet I knew better. This was not the ending of anything. It was the final calm before a conversation that would change everything. And for the first time since receiving that message weeks earlier, I felt completely ready for whatever came next. Sunday afternoon arrived with clear skies and warm temperatures. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always did. Children played basketball in a nearby driveway. Lawn mowers hummed in the distance. Families returned from church services and weekend errands. Looking around, nobody would have guessed that one of the most important conversations of my life was only a few hours away. Rebecca's flight was scheduled to land shortly after 3 o'clock. Earlier that morning, she had sent a message. "Boarding now. See you soon." I replied with 2 simple words. "Safe travels." Nothing more. The drive to the airport took about 30 minutes. Traffic moved steadily beneath a bright blue sky. The radio played quietly in the background while I thought about everything that had happened during the previous week. Not once did I question my decision. That surprised me. For months, I had been uncertain about many things. Now I felt completely clear. Around 3:30, I spotted Rebecca walking through the arrivals area. She pulled a rolling suitcase behind her and carried a large tote bag over one shoulder. The moment she saw me, she smiled and waved. Anyone watching us would have seen an ordinary married couple reuniting after a trip. In some ways, that was exactly what we looked like. During the drive home, Rebecca talked almost nonstop. She described restaurants, sightseeing tours, waterfront views, and unexpected discoveries. Every story seemed carefully selected from a collection of pleasant memories. Occasionally, Jason's name appeared, then disappeared again. I listened politely while focusing on the road ahead. After a while, Rebecca paused and looked at me. "You really are different." I smiled slightly. "You keep saying that." "Because it is true." She studied me for a moment. "You seem calmer." The answer almost made me laugh. If she only knew. Maybe I have had time to think. She nodded slowly before turning her attention back toward the window. When we finally arrived home, she carried her luggage inside and immediately began walking from room to room. Looking back, I think she was reassuring herself that everything remained exactly where she left it. The furniture had not moved. The photographs still sat on the shelves. The house looked unchanged. On the surface, she was right. That evening we ate dinner together in the dining room. Rebecca continued sharing stories while I listened. The atmosphere felt surprisingly normal, comfortable even. Yet beneath every conversation, another reality waited quietly. Around 7:30, she finally set down her glass of water and looked directly at me. "All right," she said. "Tell me what is going on." I leaned back slightly. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean." Her voice remained calm. Something changed while I was gone. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I nodded. "You are right." The confidence disappeared from her face almost immediately. Not fear. Not yet. Just uncertainty. "What happened?" she asked quietly. I stood and walked into my home office. A few moments later, I returned carrying a folder. Rebecca watched me carefully as I placed it on the coffee table between us. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Outside, porch lights glowed beneath the evening sky. Cars passed occasionally along the street. Life continued normally everywhere except inside our living room. "What is that?" she asked. I sat down across from her. "The reason you keep saying I seem different." Her eyes moved from me to the folder and back again. Slowly, I opened it and slid several documents onto the table. Rebecca looked down. The color gradually left her face. She read the first page, then the second, then the third. When she finally looked up, the confidence she had carried for weeks was gone. "You met with an attorney?" she asked. I nodded once. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. Because at that moment, Rebecca finally understood something she had never considered possible. While she thought she was taking a trip, I had been making decisions. And the consequences of those decisions were now sitting directly in front of her. Rebecca stared at the documents for what felt like an eternity. The room remained silent except for the faint sound of a clock ticking somewhere down the hallway. Finally, she looked up at me. "You were serious?" I nodded. "I have never been more serious about anything." She lowered her eyes back to the papers. For the first time since Jason had re-entered her life, she seemed completely unsure of herself. The confidence that had carried her through months of assumptions had vanished. "Why did you not say something?" she asked quietly. I leaned back in my chair. "I did." Her forehead tightened. Every time I gave you an opportunity to ask how I felt. Every time I stayed calm instead of arguing. Every time I waited for you to realize this marriage involved two people." Tears formed in her eyes, but I remained composed. Not because I wanted to hurt her, because I had already spent weeks processing emotions she was only beginning to experience. "Nothing happened on the trip," she said. "That is not the point." The words left my mouth before she could continue. "The point is that you stopped treating our marriage like a partnership long before the trip ever happened." The silence returned. Outside, a car drove past the house. A porch light from across the street glowed through the living room window. Everything looked normal. Yet both of us understood that normal no longer existed. Rebecca shook her head slowly. "I never thought you would do this." I believed her. That was the tragedy. She never thought I would establish a boundary. She never thought I would make a decision for myself. She never thought certainty could disappear. "I know," I said softly. Another long silence followed. Then something changed in her expression. Not anger. Not defensiveness. Understanding. Painful understanding. She finally saw what I had been seeing for months. She finally understood that the issue was never one trip, one message, or one person from her past. It was the accumulation of choices. The assumption that I would always be waiting exactly where she left me. "I wish I could go back," she whispered. I looked down at my hands before answering. Most people do when they finally understand the cost of their decisions. The evening continued with difficult conversations. Honest conversations. Perhaps the most honest conversations we had shared in years. There was no shouting. No dramatic scene. Just two adults sitting across from each other, confronting truths that should have been addressed long ago. As the hours passed, one realization became impossible to ignore. Respect is not lost in a single moment. It disappears gradually through small choices, small assumptions, and small acts of neglect. By the time people notice it is gone, the damage has often been done. Around midnight, I stood near the kitchen window with a glass of water. The neighborhood was quiet again, just as it had been on the night everything started. The same streetlights, the same houses, the same silence. Yet I was no longer the man who had stared at a message on his phone wondering what it meant. I knew exactly what it meant now. It meant that self-respect matters. It means that love without mutual consideration eventually becomes imbalance. And it means that staying silent is not the same thing as accepting everything. Rebecca remained seated at the table, reflecting on everything that had happened. For the first time in a very long time, she was not certain about tomorrow. Neither was I. But uncertainty felt more honest than the illusion we had been living. Sometimes people believe the strongest response is anger. In reality, the strongest response is clarity. Clarity about your worth. Clarity about your boundaries. Clarity about the future you are willing to accept. As for me, I walked forward knowing that whatever happened next would be built on truth rather than assumptions. And perhaps that was the real ending to this story. Not revenge. Not victory. Just a lesson. A reminder that relationships survive on respect, communication, and consideration. Without those things, even the strongest foundations begin to crack. Before this story ends, I would love to know your thoughts. What would you have done in this situation? And if stories about relationships, personal growth, and life lessons resonate with you, consider subscribing so you can join us for more journeys like this one in the future. Some stories entertain us. Others remind us of what truly matters. This one, I believe, did both.